And this is how to roast your roast. Today is all about roast, and if you're anything like me, I used to wonder, like, what the hell does that mean anyway? And so today I'm gonna break it all down and show you how to roast your roast with two very different recipes. One of them is gonna be this quintessential pot roast, and the other is gonna be this juicy medium red roast venison. All right, so first I'm gonna get started with the pot roast. And this is going to be like your stereotypical roast that you know and maybe love or don't love, depending on your childhood experience. I can tell you from mine, my mom didn't do a great job with pot roast, and I always hated it growing up. But this is something where when you think of a roast, that's what most people think of, a really tough cut. But the problem with calling something a roast is that they're not all the same. And I butchered and processed all of my own meat, and I would look at butcher charts, and I always thought they lacked a lot of detail, because you would look at it and it would just be like roast in the hindquarter, roast in the shoulder, roast in the neck. And does that mean like you're supposed to cook it all the same? Or are you supposed to actually roast it? And so I want to break that down today, because not all roasts should be cooked the same. All right, so this is sort of a stereotypical pot roast. I have a few tweaks to make it a little bit different, but you're gonna have your mirepoix, so you've got your onions, your celery, and I've got some carrots that I pulled from the garden. God, look how many red ones there are. It's a beautiful, colorful blend. They're a little small, but they're perfect because you can just kind of throw them right into the dish. This is a super rustic, rough chop here. I think because this is gonna get cooked for so many hours, I don't like when things are too finely chopped and then they like disintegrate into mush in the braise. I kind of like being able to have like a nice chunk of vegetable in there that's not gonna just fall apart. So we're gonna cook this in the oven, and I like to do that at a low temperature, and to me that's between 250 and 300 degrees, and I like that temperature because it's going to cook really nice and slow. It's going to stay juicy, and it'll take about 6 hours to finish. All right, so when it comes to the meat, today I am using a neck roast, and it is, in my opinion, the best cut to use for any of these kinds of slow braises. But the reason why I like it is that it has so much connective tissue, not just on the outside, but sort of woven in the middle of this whole cut. And I actually leave all of it attached and in there. All right, so you could leave this right in the pot just the way it is, and I think a lot of people prefer to do that. I want this to cook a little faster. And so I cut it into like large portions so that when you're serving a group of people, you can kind of pick up that nice little serving portion and plate it right away, and not just have to like shred the whole thing apart. And so I'll cut like maybe 2-inch wide pieces. There we go. So we've got nice big chunks of meat. And all this is gonna fall apart deliciously. All right, now we're gonna season this, and I'm gonna keep it simple with a little bit of salt, pepper. I've got some dried rosemary that I'll just crush over the top. And what's kind of cool about this recipe is I like to go with a brighter, lighter kind of flavor profile. So I'm gonna add quite a bit of mustard. This is the mustard I like. It's Creole mustard. It's got a lot of zip to it. And then last but not least, I'm gonna add a little white wine because I already have some in the pantry and I can't drink it anyway, so I might as well cook with it. All right, We are ready to cook. We'll do this in an enameled cast iron Dutch oven. I like these because they're super heavy and they retain their heat really well. And we're gonna sear the meat first over medium-high heat so it gets nice and brown. I actually really like using beef tallow to sear the meat. I used to use oil because it was a neutral flavor, but beef tallow has sort of a meaty flavor that I think adds a lot to venison. Plus, it's got a really high smoke point. Whenever you're browning meat, just make sure you leave a little bit of space in between each because it's going to sort of let out some condensation and you want that to be able to evaporate with the heat. So giving it that space lets it develop a little more color. Now we'll saute some aromatics. And then deglaze it with a little bit of white wine. And then the secret ingredient, mustard. I do about like 2 tablespoons worth. And we'll return the meat. Just kind of nestle that in there from that pan. Last but not least, I got some little baby potatoes so that this is just essentially a great one-pot meal. And then again, going with the theme of light and bright, I'm gonna use chicken stock instead of beef or venison. Okay. All right, now I want to cook something that I get really excited about. This is a mushroom rubbed roast venison with au jus that is from my new cookbook, Wild and Whole. And I love it so much because it's the exact opposite of the pot roast that we just did. This is actually the sirloin tip, which is found right above the kneecap, kind of like what would be a quadricep of the animal. It's actually a very tender cut of meat, and we're gonna cook this muscle whole. So the first thing I need to do for this recipe is trim off the outside. The only silver skin that I wanna trim is the silver skin that's found on the outside of the meat. We are not gonna open this up and trim everything on the inside. And that's because it has actually these lovely little pockets of juice and fat and flavor that I want to keep inside there. And as you're trimming this, make sure to save the little scrappy bits. You can give it to your dog, which mine would be more than happy to take, but I'm actually going to put it in the au jus that I make that's gonna serve with this. So this is what I make if I've got company coming over for dinner, because it is, I kid you not, fail-proof, easy recipe, but it's like a showstopper. So this is the pot we're gonna use to put the meat in and make the au jus. So that's basically just a broth that accompanies the meat. And usually if you're making a prime rib, you've got all these drippings and fats that would traditionally go into it. This venison is not gonna have any of that, so we're gonna spice this up by adding a little bit of red wine and beef stock when we make that later. So before we roast this, we're actually gonna truss this with some kitchen twine, and the reason is because you want it to cook really evenly, but it has this really nice shape to it. So you're gonna take your twine, cut it into pieces, and then just tie it at intervals. All right, let's give this meat some flavor here. I am making a rub that's made with mushrooms, and it's so good on like a million different things, but particularly with red meat. So I'm using porcini mushrooms that have been dried. And what we're gonna do is pulse this in a spice grinder to give it sort of a coarse consistency. And then we're gonna mix it with a little salt, pepper, and some herbs. Gosh, this is like one of my favorite things on earth. It smells so good. It's probably one of the earthiest mushrooms out there. So I've got some peppercorns that I'm just gonna roughly pound out. All right, so we've got some black pepper. We're also gonna do some herbs. I like rosemary, I also like thyme. So I'm gonna add the porcini powder, or the ground mushrooms. And then last but not least, we need a little bit of salt. So that's it, that's all that's in here. And this will store in the pantry for a very long time until it goes stale. So you wanna use it within like 6 months just so that the mushrooms don't lose their potency. So we're gonna pan roast this, which means we're starting on the stovetop by searing it in really high heat to get those nice brown crust on the outside. Then I'm gonna transfer it to a baking sheet and into the oven. So the oven's gonna be a really low temperature, 225 to be exact. And there's a really good reason for that. So unlike the pot roast, which is in a pot of a bunch of liquids to make it moist and juicy as it cooks, this is a dry roasting technique because we want it to stay dry and brown on the outside. But what we don't want is it for it to be dry. And the best way to mitigate that is through the oven temperature being really low. So the objective here is just to create a nice brown crust. This is what adds savoriness. We're not trying to cook it all the way through. So that's why I'm using like the highest heat that I can. And then I'm gonna roll it around so that it's brown all the way on the outside. All right, so when I said this is an easy, no-fail recipe, it's because I use an oven thermometer. So this goes into the thickest part of the meat right through the middle. That way we can monitor exactly how it's cooking and what temperature it is in the middle. So what's great about this is that this goes in the oven, it's very hands-off. So that gives you time to cook side dishes, drink wine, entertain, whatever you want to do. Just keep an eye on the temperature. If you're going for medium rare, which is about 128 to 130, you want to pull it 8 to 10 degrees before it hits that temperature. So I'm going to take this out at 120, 122 degrees and then let it rest, and that carryover heat will finish cooking it. While this is in the oven, we're gonna make the au jus from the meat. We're gonna add some garlic, a little bit of thyme, and we're gonna do some red wine. And the key component here is stock. I'm gonna use some elk stock that I had from the freezer. And as you can see, it's nice and gelatinous, which is a good thing. But I don't have quite enough, so I'm also gonna supplement with some beef stock. So if you don't have venison stock, beef stock works great. All right, this has been simmering for about 45 minutes, so it's really nice and reduced. I'm gonna go ahead and strain this out from those big little chunks of meat and silver skin that were in there earlier. All right, this is 122. We are ready to take it out of the oven. It's been like 45 minutes or so, maybe closer to an hour. So it took a little bit of time, but not too long. All right, so now it just needs to rest before we carve and serve this. And Give it a good 8 to 10 minutes so that all the juices can go back into the meat. And remember, there's gonna be some carryover heat. So 122 is pretty rare, so we're gonna let this come to temperature closer to the 128, 130 range. So there's a couple different thicknesses in which you can slice it. You can do nice thick slices if you're gonna serve this for like a really elegant dinner with some potatoes or vegetables. That is ideal for me. All right, and then to serve it, look at how gorgeous rosy red it is. It's like exactly what I'm looking for. And then you can finish it with a little flaky salt, some cracked pepper, or more of that little rosemary mushroom rub. And then last but definitely not least, some of this au jus. This is my perfect ideal juicy red roast. Now I'm gonna check on the pot roast. Ooh, that looks good. Oh yeah, this is already falling apart. Perfect. So I am sure you are used to having this type of pot roast. You've probably been raised on it, and this might be a totally different experience for you. So I hope that this is inspiring you to be creative, to think outside the box a little bit in the kitchen, and don't be afraid to try new things, because this is probably one of the best things that I've ever made, and it's definitely a great thing to try at home and impress your loved ones, family, friends, whoever.